The first element, because in a theory, you want to prioritize elements, prioritize and organize existing knowledge. The first point that I want to make that's a non negotiable for really any class, I think, whether it's at a distance, at a remove, or at a right there face to face, is to use expansive framing to trouble students' background knowledge and your own curriculum. Expansive framing was developed by Randy Engel, who I believe is out of Iowa, but I don't know for sure. But Dr. Engel was talking specifically about the way that you can frame a course. You can have it bounded where the courses and the content exists for that special moment in time, and then the information is useful only for that course, and then it passes away. Makes me think of all of the Spanish classes that I had when I was in high school and middle school down in Florida. Those courses existed, but there really wasn't any expectation that we would use it or learn about intercultural understanding or anything. On the other hand, expansive framing intentionally looks for the sides of and edges of your curriculum and your skills and the student's background understanding, their prior understanding, and how those can link to the worlds around them. And by taking this sort of framing, you're looking particularly to set up an occasion, opportunities for transfer, occasions for transfer. Not necessarily saying that transfer will happen or that it will be positive transfer, but it'll be there intentionally built in from the beginning, increasing the likelihood. So that's expansive framing. And I'm saying use expansive framing in your course design to trouble students' prior information and your curriculum. So let's look at troublesome knowledge. Meyer and Land, back in 2003, produced this report, Threshold Concepts and Troublesome Knowledge. It got picked up in the composition world that I live in. So it got picked up in Adler-Kastner and Wardle's edited collection, Threshold Concepts in the Study of Writing, which is absolutely essential for anyone who's teaching any sort of writing, especially the type of writing that I do, where you're setting students up in class to practice skills that they're intended to use outside of your four walls, without you around, without all of the sort of social and physical and spatial and temporal cues on their own. This is from 2015, by the way. And then it also gets picked up in this 2017 edited volume by Anson and Moore, Critical Transitions, Writing in the Question of Transfer, based on a symposium that happened at Elon University back in 2015, at about the time that Wardle and Adler-Kastner were creating their book. And actually, these authors participated in the same symposium. So at that time, this is where it's coming from. And threshold concepts are those sort of aha understandings that once you have them, you can't go back. So an example would be essays are used to actually test the validity of your idea and not just jump through a hoop for your teacher. Another one would be this notion of expansive framing, right? You are typically trained that, hey, when you're doing a course, or at least I was 20 years ago when I was an undergrad in teacher ed, you look at, hey, here's what the course is going to be. Here are my standards. Let me live with inside of the standards. Let me make sure that I'm hitting them. and all of that, rather than looking for these more undefined, have to be, because they are interstitial, they are liminal, so they have to be undefined, um, and edges of the course that link to the world around them. Um, the world around you, the world around your curriculum, the world around your students, and all of the relationships of those to get to each other. So, a threshold concept in science would be this notion that not all hypotheses are supposed to be true from the outset, right? A threshold concept in education would be this role that media you use to instruct and the media that you use to interchange with and communicate with your students, for your students communicate with your curricula, with each other. The media itself shapes the affordances and the ways of seeing. Um, this is getting back to Marshall McLuhan from the 70s. So those are some examples of threshold concepts. And I'm saying use expansive framing to present threshold concepts for your students in the hopes that they can transfer well. There's one more piece. And this is also coming out of Meyer and Land. This is the second piece of their title, Troublesome Knowledge. Kathy Yancey, who I'll be talking about more hereafter, talks about not just activating students' prior knowledge, or in this case, my colleagues' prior knowledge of how do you teach special ed, but the whole notion of prior knowledge, prior experience, prior memory, prior. And we all have had those students who come into our classes with locked in sets of ideas. And if we're trying to get them into crossing the thresholds, becoming more engaged, thinking more and more, thinking and practicing more and more like an expert in the field. This is the correspondence concept. Jeffrey Wilhelm, in his book, You Gotta Be the Book, from 2008, brings it up. This notion that your course, by the end of it, your students' thinking and understanding and skills should more closely correspond to experts in the field. The way to do this work of getting students to the threshold and then getting them across the threshold to a fuller participation in a community of practice from that peripheral sort of understanding. And here I'm referencing, just sort of hand waving, LeVay and Wegner's community of practice model that I'll talk about more later. Which brings in that notion of legitimate peripheral participation, which seems to me to be lacking in the community of inquiry model. But the way to get students across those thresholds is to trouble their prior, to put them in situations or expose them to perspectives where their previous understandings break down somehow, occasioning a moment of, oh, in thinking routines out of Project Zero from Harvard, they use these things of this frame of, I used to think, but now I think, right? I think their actual phrase is, I used to think, but now I know. And I think that's a little bit too strong of a framing. So I don't use that with my students. I used to think, but now I think, leaves them a little bit more with a wiggle room that, hey, you can have a third draft as well. But Troubling knowledge is some sort of situation where what you knew or what you know breaks down. In March of 2020, I had, well, we knew that COVID was coming. And my school, that, again, designed for students with executive function difficulties, communication difficulties, attention difficulties, and because attention regulation difficulties getting new information into working memory into long-term memory, and I'm using learning. I'm glossing that as learning is a change in long-term memory. Maybe it's a change in declarative or conceptual or procedural memory, but still. And if you have kids who aren't paying attention to these linkages in the first place, there's going to be no change in your long-term memory. And so when we found out that we were going to have to go totally remote, and this in a school where students have to turn in their cell phones every day, where a lot of what we do depends on unmediated direct work, where our founder was a clinical psychologist from the 70s, the height of behaviorism. So we do a lot of antecedent behavior consequence, behavior modification, not even behavior management, not classroom management. We're behavior mod school. Or at least that's one of the ways that we like to see ourselves. The notion of getting all of our instruction in our classes in our communities that had been running from August 2019 up until middle of March 2020 online at a distance without all of the structures and cues, environmental cues, social cues that we have here on campus to keep students attended mentally, and emotionally, not just physically, was a challenge. And the troublesome knowledge that I was dealing with there was a lot of our faculty, not so much our students. Students were fantastic. But the faculty had in their heads what they knew was that you had to be on campus in order to maintain students' attention on your lesson, because if they weren't paying attention, you wouldn't get any learning out of them. And in a world where they were in their bedrooms, not in our rather strict professional dress code, that there would not be those cues to set them up. And then how do you do behavior modification over online, right? And so one of the things that I talked a lot about then to my faculty, was looking at all of the other things we do. And we'll talk more about that in the next video on Philip Schlechty's theory and model of engagement. That built in processing time, which is the notion after next, cognitive calories, cognitive load theory. And the way that you build in the cadence of your course differently to address students' different needs for processing speed. How do you, in a academic setting, communicate across and what you need? How do you leave a course comment? How do you communicate? the issues of communication and citizenship in a mediated environment that are important to both teachers and students. We chose to go with so Conrad and Openo in this book uh, talk about from Athabasca Press, University Press, which is a fantastic place. I've gotten a lot of information and really good advice for teaching online from from the University Press. Talk about different generations of online distance education. And some of our teachers, particularly in the elementary school at the very beginning, tried to go with a first generation correspondence education model. This was your hard copy packets on the theory that students would be able to work through their own pace. Parents wouldn't have to sit down with them. We ended up with a model that really we were allowed to do because we live in the northern suburbs of Atlanta and our families had adequate bandwidth to do two-way synchronous. We use Google Meet. And so talking about ways that you would manage engagement, you had chat blasts, you had shared Google Docs, you had you had teachers intentionally building in time where they stopped talking and the kids had to, or the kids had to write down questions. We saw a massive increase in the use of exit tickets as a regular ongoing practice. It sort of evaporated when we all came back on campus. But because we had our teachers needed to have those check-ins, and so they mediated. They used either Google Forms or Google Docs to be able. Sometimes the comment feature to be able to check in the moment with our students. So, using expansive framing, looking at building the course and building the lesson in ways that aren't just bounded by the standards and curriculum and the 36 weeks, 45 minutes, 4 walls of the course. Using expansive framing in order to get students across the threshold concepts and to promote transfer and to trouble what they come in with. So that's the first point that I want to make.